In the year of 1974, that was the last year Americans had a public view inside of Fort Knox, roughly 3 years after America went off of the gold standard, which, from a statistical perspective, means more than half of Americans alive today were born after the last public visit inside of Fort Knox, which is just crazy to think about. And I really think over the last few years, Americans have seen a growing mistrust between themselves and the government when it comes to knowing what to believe or not. And with Fort Knox being arguably the most well-kept secret and fortified place in America, it definitely begs a question, or at least a place to look, when it comes to believing in the US government or not. Now, over the last week or so, we've seen Doge, people like Rand Paul and Donald Trump, and even Elon Musk really pointing the finger at auditing Fort Knox to see if the Americans' gold is still in those vaults. Because looking at Fort Knox, it is a very large installation with very large gold reserves, totaling close to about 150 million ounces. Now, when it comes to looking at Fort Knox here, I have some pretty interesting statistics here when it comes to just the value of the gold. And with gold prices hitting an all-time high, climbing above $2,000 an ounce over the last few months to almost $3,000, that means that there is now close to $450 billion in gold still in those vaults, assuming it is there. Now, when it comes to auditing Fort Knox, I think that what Americans want to see, and I guess like what public figures like Elon Musk have even referred to doing, is a public walk view of Fort Knox to really just see in person if the gold is still there. Because over the last few decades, we've really only gotten a few yeses from some large government public figures saying that the gold is still there, and that's really hard to take them at their word when it comes to believing them if the gold is still there or not. And what's even crazier is that the American president here, Donald Trump, actually does not even have legal access to visit the gold vaults. That is up to other folks in the government, and it's an even higher level of security, which is pretty crazy to think that it is pretty much restricted to almost everybody in the government, except for a few folks. So when it comes to the gold in Fort Knox, supposedly they hold roughly 56% of the total U.S. gold reserves, with additional reserves stored at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and Denver Mint. The history of Fort Knox. It was built in 1936 during Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. The reason for the construction was to safeguard U.S. gold reserves during Depression and beyond. It was made of very high-grade granite, steel, reinforced concrete, and such, with walls up to 4 feet thick. So this place was designed to be essentially impenetrable. And if you've really looked at Fort Knox from an aerial perspective, it's this humongous concrete building, essentially in a field with landmines surrounding it, multiple layers of fences, and it's even guarded with a military base with 30,000 soldiers stationed nearby. So essentially, nobody can get into this base. It's probably the most difficult place to get to in the entire world if somebody really wanted to try to get in. So knowing this here, I mean, obviously here, the American government is trying to safeguard this place like there is no tomorrow. They do not want to let anybody into this place, whether it's to guard a secret or guard the reserves of gold. Now, the big concern here when Donald Trump and Doge hopefully officially do go into Fort Knox and audit the gold and see if it's still there. What needs to happen in that circumstance is that they actually need to see the gold, and not just see it, they need to weigh it, test it, scan pretty much every single bar to see if it is legit or not. Because even in the pictures in 1974, I believe that they only visited one of the many vaults inside of Fort Knox. Which, if there are many vaults, that means each one has to be inspected with probably hundreds or maybe even thousands of gold bars inside of each vault. You could paint a lead bar, gold plate it, and make it look like gold. But that doesn't mean it has all the same value as gold, right? We have to weigh it, right? Essentially, when it comes to testing things like gold, if you can properly measure it and weigh it, you can definitely determine if it is actually gold or not. You can even drill it and do other tests as well. But what we want to uncover, what we want to really see here, is get transparency from the government to see if they're lying to us or not. Because honestly here, if there is no gold in Fort Knox, and there hasn't been for decades, it kind of makes sense as to why they would just tell the American people that there is gold in those vaults. Because on the flip side, if they were to be honest with the American people and say that there actually was no gold in those vaults, that would potentially cause some extreme fear and uncertainty in the public markets, especially when it comes to trusting the government. Because if this entire time there's been no gold in those vaults, what other lies could the American government be hiding from the American people? Which is the big question here, right? I mean, this place has CCTV cameras all over the places, laser tripwires, booby-trapped entrances, last inspected 1974, which wasn't even an audit, which is crazy to think, right? It was just a journalist and congressperson visit. The last known official audit was in 1953. So essentially a partial audit was conducted by the US Treasury, but critics argue it was never fully transparent. So it's almost like Fort Knox has never, ever even been fully transparent with the American people. So it comes down to the solvency of the US and how trustworthy they are to the American people. And let's suppose that that Fort Knox isn't officially stacked with US held gold. That also begs a question on other gold vaults around the world in terms of how transparent they have been with their people in those countries as well. Because these gold vaults, right? Even if they hold, let's say Fort Knox, 150 million ounces of gold, who's to say, even if it is there, if it belongs to the American people? The gold there could be owned or actually have the ownership from other nations across the seas, for example, as well. So essentially, what would need to happen is, even if there is a live walkthrough through Fort Knox, it can't just be a live video walkthrough opening up the vaults and showing the gold. It needs to be tested, weighed, and I really think a third party, someone like Doge, for example, needs to be transparent with the people on this one for sure. Because the flip side, if it does all turn out to be false, right, when it comes to what's actually inside of Fort Knox, right, let's say there is no gold, the financial effects, right, could be a global financial panic, stock market collapse, government crisis, mass public protests, and the list goes on, right? And of course, these are all assumptions. We just don't want those assumptions to become true, and it would lead to an economic meltdown. Because when it comes to the gold inside of those vaults, many people at least believe that gold has no value. But essentially, it's extremely rare. It's rather lightweight and portable when it comes to looking at how much value 1 ounce of gold can have, right? 1 ounce of gold is roughly $3,000, and that can get you pretty far. And it lasts forever, never tarnishes, and it's always going to be in there. It'll last billions and billions of years. So let's say that there is a recession or inflationary, hyperinflation scenario in the United States. The idea of having gold is sort of as a hedge in the event of a financial recession or something along those lines. If it turns out that we eventually someday have hyperinflation or a terrible recession, and we don't have any gold to stop the chaos going on with the hyperinflation, or at least for it to come to some aid for the American people down the road, that means that there's no backup plan, and we can never revert back to the gold standard, for instance, and we'll live in a fiat economy forever when it comes to fiat currency, the US dollar. So I believe that what will happen, my perspective on this is, and belief, is that if there actually is no gold inside of Fort Knox, I believe that means that there will never be an actual walkthrough and live audit of Fort Knox, because revealing the actual truth to the American people to show them that there is no gold in those vaults just isn't worth it. And I think that there might even be, like, let's say that all of a sudden Trump and Elon Musk and Doge are on the cusp of entering Fort Knox. Maybe they're about to visit in a few days. I wouldn't be surprised if a few higher up top government officials who work in the top secret departments that nobody knows about, they come tap Donald Trump on the shoulder and they whisper in his ear essentially a few things that he doesn't want to hear, but they're tough truths. And the truths just being that there might actually be no gold in Fort Knox, or maybe that it just doesn't belong to the United States. And that truth, if exposed to the American people, could potentially be so devastating from a financial perspective that it's best to just keep the lie going and never be honest with the American people. So, unfortunately, that might be the exact reason as to why we've never had an actual audit of Fort Knox since the early 1950s, and why we may never be able to see inside of the installation again. So, it kind of makes sense as to why Fort Knox is so heavily guarded. One, it's either that there is actually gold in there and it's an incredibly valuable vault to keep safe, or it is simply a lie that must be kept, and we have to keep regurgitating the same lie to the American people to say that the gold is in those vaults. So if that is the case, if there actually is gold in the vaults, that might raise the chances of there being an actual audit. But if we never see an audit, I would say in the next 1 or 2 years, coming from Donald Trump and the Doge team, then that would certainly raise the probability that there really is no gold in those vaults. And that is my main concern, is that would just be the truth. And everything in the United States financial system really relies on trust, right? The US American dollar is essentially backed by nothing. You could argue it's backed by a large military and things like that, but behind it there is nothing, like there used to be in the old days with it being backed by gold, right? But nowadays, the whole financial system is backed by trust. There's nothing tangible behind the US dollar. It's just a piece of paper. And the idea of there being an empty gold vault in there would make the crisis even worse and possibly even push inflation higher as people become more worried about the solvency of the US government. So those are really my concerns there from a high level. I'll be curious to watch over the coming 1 to 2 years. I don't think we're going to get a review in the super short term. But over the next 1 or 2 years, I will be watching for that audit of Fort Knox. But with that being said, thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I will see you on the next video. Bye-bye.